there was mercy to be had. As I've mentioned in passing, Alaric's sack of Rome was not an unrestrained anarchic affair. At this point, both the sacking Goths and the sacked Romans were Christians of one sort or another, so Alaric declared churches and religious artifacts to be off-limits. And further, he sent out word to the citizens of the city that anyone taking refuge in a church would be left alone. Blood would not be spilled in the houses of God. But beyond that, well, this was an exercise in punitive plundering, so something's got to be fair game, and indeed, most things were. The wealth of the lavish homes and old imperial residences were stripped, stuffed into bags, and carted off. Safe areas were beaten, raped, and killed. The old pagan temples were looted without compunction, and it is with a heavy heart that I report that this is the moment when the ashes of Augustus, Hadrian, and so many other great imperial figures, which had been kept safe for centuries inside of their mausoleums, were toppled and scattered to the winds of time. For 3 days, the Goths ran amok on a destructive treasure hunt that saw the best of classical Rome looted, broken, or lost. Now, the sack of Rome was no great strategic blow to the empire in military terms. Politically, it did not signal the end of the old imperial order, and in terms of the decline and fall of the Western Empire as a whole, it was more milepost than destination. But that does not mean that it was not a major blow to the citizens of the empire at the time. Morale had been wavering for years, and the thought of barbarians pillaging the Eternal City was so inconceivable that when it happened, a sort of confused despair seemed to settle in. The psychological shockwaves were strong enough that it drove St. Augustine, the bishop of the North African port of Hippo, to begin writing The City of God, a massive political and religious treatise defending Christianity from the increasingly pervasive view that Rome had been sacked because it had abandoned its pagan heritage. Augustine did not dwell on religious cause and effect, so much as he argued that everyone was missing the point. We ought to be dedicating ourselves to the eternal and non-corporeal city of God, as revealed through the divine incarnation of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, rather than fretting about what happens to the base and worldly city of man. This call not to save Rome, but to look past it, was a powerful comfort to a population facing what looked an awful lot to them like the end of the world. When published, the City of God almost immediately became the official political platform of the Catholic Church, and it maintained that undisputed place until St. Thomas Aquinas came along in the 1200s and offered his Aristotelian revisions. Meanwhile, back in the City of Man, the Goths had reached their load limit after 3 days of looting, and Alaric led his men out of Rome laden with treasure. As the barbarian masses disappeared over the southern horizon, the people of the Eternal City were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered city. Some resolved to stay and rebuild, but most looked at the trash shops and broken homes and asked, why bother? Refugees began to stream out of Rome, beginning a cycle of economic depression, exodus, further economic depression, and further exodus that would in time take Rome from a population high of perhaps 1 million people down to a low of just 20,000 during the Middle Ages. After rocking the Roman world by sacking its most sacred city, though, Alaric did not dwell on the place he had just earned for himself in history. He was already on to the next big thing. The sack of Rome had gotten him a lot of stuff, but it had not gotten him the peace, security, or power that he was really looking for. If threatening, and then looting, Rome had not been enough to shake Honorius out of his stubborn stupor, then maybe cutting off the Italian food supply would be. The Gothic king led his people south to the toe of the peninsula of Italy, where he planned to launch an invasion of North Africa. Seizing the African grain supply had long been on Alaric's to-do list, and after failing to push Attalus into doing his dirty work for him, Alaric decided to take matters into his own hands. But the cobbled-together Gothic fleet of mostly stolen ships hit a storm almost as soon as they launched, and they were forced back to the safety of the Italian harbors. While the Goths regrouped and planned their next move, they were hit with a further and potentially more debilitating setback. In the autumn of 410, Alaric caught a fever, and he died. He was in his early 40s and was just months removed from the signature event that would ensure his name was and will be seared into the history books for all time. Fearful that their dead leader's body would be desecrated if left out in the open, the Goths diverted the course of a nearby river, buried Alaric in the dry bed, and then returned the stream to its natural course. Neither Alaric's body nor the hoard of treasure that would have presumably been buried with him was ever found. Control of the Goths fell to Alaric's brother Ataulf, who will lead them for the next 5 tumultuous years, as they marched from Italy to Gaul, and from Gaul to Spain, making, breaking, and then remaking alliances along the way, as the Western Roman world, sometimes violently, and sometimes diplomatically, reshaped itself. The geographic center of that reshaping would be Gaul, where the political and military power of the Western Empire was about to fracture still further, before being cobbled back together by a dour general who history has come to know as Constantius III. Constantius was of Illyrian origin, and likely came up through the ranks of Theodosius's post-Adrianople Eastern legions, before, like Stilicho, following the emperor west to put down the revolt of Eugenius and Arbogast. He doesn't really pop into recorded history until 411, though, so it is simply an educated guess that his career followed an arc similar to Stilicho's, to whom it is also educatedly guessed Constantius was a loyal subordinate of. In 411, though, he had risen high enough that Honorius appointed him to the task of finally taking down Constantine III, who was presently back in Gaul, holding down that ever-shrinking patch of grass from his headquarters in Arles. But as Constantius readied the Italian army for war with Constantine, word came down that the general Gerontius had finally launched his expected attack from Spain, and after defeating a division of Constantine's forces near modern Vienne, he had moved on to Arles and put the city to siege. So now Constantius was facing 2 hostile armies in the same place at the same time. To get to Constantine, he would have to go through Gerontius. Rather than wait for the 2 enemy armies to wear each other out, however, Constantius decided to aggressively move in and attack Gerontius while he was still occupied with his siege. This proved to be a winning strategy, because Gerontius's disunited army of barbarians and regular Roman forces panicked at the first sight of Constantius's army, and most of Gerontius's men chose to desert to the approaching Italian army rather than fight a battle trapped against the walls of Arles. Abandoned by his troops, Gerontius fled, but he appears to have been tracked down and cornered by Spanish soldiers from his own ex-army, and likely killed himself after becoming trapped. Back in Arles, the breaking of Gerontius's army had done nothing to improve the situation for Constantine, however, as Constantius simply stepped in and resumed the siege. Constantine's only hope was that Frankish reinforcements from the Lower Rhine would arrive in time to lift the siege. But, though said reinforcements did arrive in time, Constantius simply drove them off, which is not so good if that was your only hope. And indeed it was. When Constantine desperately called for reinforcements a second time, the call was ignored by the soldiers remaining in the Lower Rhineland. They were no dummies. They could see which way the winds were blowing. Constantine was now on his own. Constantius sent a note into the city promising that if Constantine ended his resistance and handed himself over, that he would be allowed to live. Recognizing that his position was hopeless, Constantine agreed to the terms and surrendered. But as was so often the case in these situations, Constantius' deal was just a ruse to lure Constantine out of the city, and the captured general was executed while on the road from Arles to Ravenna. Okay, so that's it then, right? Constantius has come along, saved the day, and defeated all existing enemies of the imperial throne. The Western Empire is now back under the united control of Ravenna. Right? Oh, would that it were so. But as Arles was falling, a new usurper appeared along the lower Rhine. The forces gathered there, dominated by a mix of Franks, Burgundians, and Alans, had been aligned with Constantine until they stopped returning his phone calls. When it became clear that their patron was going down, they grabbed a local Gallic noble named Jovinus and hailed him as Augustus in the city of Mainz. Like an oversized game of whack-a-mole, as one usurper got whacked, another popped up on the other side of the board. But before he could deal with this new usurper, Constantius was going to have to come back to Italy and deal with a more immediate problem. Ataulf and the Goths had been making their way north, and were now getting a bit too close to Ravenna for anyone's comfort. So Constantius headed back across the Alps to hopefully push the Goths out of Italy once and for all. Next week, Constantius will succeed in pushing the Goths out of Italy, but rather than driving them east, back to Illyria, they will instead press on north to the newly pacified, but still fragile, southern Gaul. As you can imagine, the appearance of this Gothic horde is going to have a major impact on the precarious military and political balance of the Northwest Empire. Who will the Goths side with? Who will they then betray? And what would the ramifications be of a Gothic king, like, say, Ataulf, fathering a son with an imperial princess, like, say, Gallia Placidia? Would those ramifications be even more extreme if a childless emperor, like, say, Honorius, were to die without naming a clear heir? I think that they would. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 165, Reviving the Roman Name. In early 412 AD, two forces converged on northern Italy. Coming up from the south was Ataulf and the Goths, who were now more than a year removed from the sack of Rome, but still no closer to finding the permanent home or the permanent place in the Roman world that they had been searching for. Coming down from the north was Constantius III, commander-in-chief of the Western Roman army, who had just whipped two usurpers in the span of a single summer. Neither side was entirely sure what the motivations of the other were, so they gingerly skirted around each other, trying to get a feel for what the other intended to do. Were the Goths going to follow up on their sack of Rome by attacking Ravenna? Was Constantius going to go for the hat trick and press for a decisive battle? As it turned out, the answer to both of these questions was a resounding